What enemy forces did today crossed a line that NATO commanders had hoped would hold. And when that line moved, not broke, but moved, the Allied response did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with purpose, and with a level of coordinated force that even seasoned defense observers described as extraordinary. But here is what no one is saying loudly enough tonight. The enemy didn't lose ground today. They gave it. And that distinction, that terrifying, calculated distinction, is the story you need to understand before this night is over. For months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal intelligence releases, just signals that the opposing force was preparing something that defied the conventional logic of this conflict. The enemy has been aggressive, yes, but they have been disciplined in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a signature. Every advance telegraphed, every push preceded by noise, logistical noise, communication noise, the predictable hum of an army preparing to move forward. But what set off alarm bells in NATO command this week was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor hostile military activity know the indicators, the uptick in encrypted communication traffic that precedes a major operation, the forward repositioning of fuel and ammunition depots, the subtle reorientation of air defense systems toward new coordinates, the sudden disappearance of mid-level commanders from monitored communication channels. All of that went quiet, not reduced, not slowed, quiet. And there is a rule, unwritten but universally understood among those who study this force, that whenever they go quiet, it means something is about to get very, very loud. Senior intelligence officials monitoring the situation describe the silence not as inactivity, but as compression, the kind that comes just before a controlled detonation. They were right. Early Thursday morning, Allied surveillance systems detected what analysts described as a deliberate, coordinated withdrawal, including the pullback of forward artillery units that had not been repositioned in over 14 months. These are not the kinds of assets you move unless you are signaling something very specific, a feint, a trap, or a full strategic repositioning ahead of a second stage offensive. Allied observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the enemy was changing its posture. And when a force of this size, this capability, shifts posture without explanation, even by a matter of kilometers, Allied command pays attention. Because in warfare, ground surrendered voluntarily is not ground lost. It is ground used. What appeared on the surface as a retreat, what some early reports were already framing as a victory, as proof that pressure was working, as a sign that the enemy was cracking, was, according to multiple senior defense officials, nothing of the sort. It was a message, and the message read, "Come forward. We are ready for you when you do." The forward positions they abandoned had been held at significant cost for nearly a year. Giving them up overnight, without a fight, without even a rearguard skirmish, that is not the behavior of a force in retreat. That is the behavior of a force that has finished preparing. The intelligence assessment issued by Allied command tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Briefing after briefing throughout the day described the enemy's withdrawal as deliberate, rehearsed. And perhaps most importantly, pre-sighted, meaning the territory they vacated had almost certainly already been mapped, pre-calculated, and zeroed in for the artillery and long-range systems now pulling back behind it. That is a strategy, a specific, documented, historically recognized strategy. It is called elastic defense, and it has broken advancing armies before. You draw the enemy forward into ground you control. You let them celebrate. You let them stretch their supply lines, expose their flanks, abandon their own defensive posture in the excitement of apparent momentum, and then you close the trap. But this strategy only works if the opposing side doesn't recognize it in time. Allied command did. In fact, the response today was among the most measured and precise we have seen throughout this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of detecting the withdrawal, Allied forces launched deep precision strikes against the repositioned enemy assets, not the abandoned forward positions, but the rear positions the enemy had moved into. These weren't standard air support operations. These were coordinated multi-domain strikes. systems that Allied forces only deploy when they are targeting the infrastructure of a second-stage offensive, not just its frontline elements. They were not chasing the retreating forces. They were ahead of them. Tonight, defense officials confirmed that Allied forces launched a series of deep strike operations against identified enemy logistics nodes, including a major fuel and munitions transfer hub that had recently been activated after 18 months of dormancy, which analysts believe was being prepared to sustain a renewed large-scale push once the elastic defense trap was sprung. Allied forces moved before the enemy could finish positioning. They struck the fuel depots, they struck the communication relay infrastructure, they struck the mobile artillery units that were almost certainly preparing to support the incoming offensive's second phase. In other words, Allied forces didn't just avoid the trap, they dismantled the mechanism designed to spring it. The logistics web that would have made the enemy's maneuver operational, the fuel, the communications, the fire support, was struck with a precision that left military analysts genuinely stunned. This is what made tonight's intelligence warning so urgent in the first place. The enemy's withdrawal wasn't just a tactical redeployment, it was actionable. It was the opening move of something larger and more dangerous than anything attempted in recent months. It represented the kind of maneuver that could have fundamentally altered the battlefield if left unchecked for even another 48 hours. And Allied command, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't bomb the empty trenches the enemy left behind. They didn't chase ghosts across vacated ground. They hit the machinery of what was coming next. They hit the engine before it could start. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Senior defense analysts now believe that the enemy's latest maneuver was specifically designed to test the resolve and response speed of Allied command following a period of internal political pressure and public debate over the cost and direction of continued support. The enemy wanted to see whether Allied forces would rush forward into the vacated ground without thinking. They wanted to see whether the allure of apparent victory would override tactical discipline. But instead, the exact opposite happened. Allied command didn't advance recklessly into the trap. They recognized what they were looking at, communicated it up the chain at extraordinary speed, and authorized a preemptive deep strike response that was so precise, so well-timed, that by the accounts of multiple officials, the enemy's own command structure was caught off guard by how quickly the window closed. You don't surprise a force that has been operating in this theater for this long easily. But today, Allied forces did exactly that. Analysts speaking with journalists under condition of anonymity described the enemy's maneuver as a probing strategy, a way to gauge Allied reaction time and decision-making agility before committing to the full second phase offensive. What they found was not the hesitation they were looking for. Allied forces proved today that they remain both alert and adaptive. Their strike operations were not only executed with precision, they were sequenced so carefully that multiple target sets were neutralized within a window so narrow that enemy forces had no time to disperse or harden their exposed positions. That sequencing matters because it reveals something profound about the state of Allied intelligence and coordination. It shows that Allied command is not reacting to this conflict one day at a time. They are operating ahead of it. As reports continued coming in throughout Thursday evening, we learned more about the full scale of the Allied response. Aerial assets from multiple Allied nations carried out coordinated strike packages, forcing the enemy's newly repositioned air defense systems to activate, thereby revealing their locations to Allied electronic warfare platforms that had been waiting for exactly that signal. Ground-based precision systems targeted a series of forward logistics points that had been quietly reactivated in the last 72 hours, largely under the assumption that the apparent withdrawal would buy time before any Allied response. Electronic warfare units operating along a broad front reportedly disrupted the encrypted communications backbone used by enemy forward commanders to coordinate the repositioning in real time. This wasn't just a counterstrike. This wasn't just a deterrent signal. This was a systematic degradation of the enemy's operational capacity. This was a dismantling, piece by piece, of the infrastructure needed to turn a strategic withdrawal into a strategic offensive. And operational continuity, the ability to maintain a coherent, connected fighting force across a vast and shifting front, is the one thing this enemy has struggled to sustain since the first phase of the conflict began. For every maneuver they have attempted, Allied forces have countered with something that compounds the difficulty of what comes next. Today's response follows that pattern, but today it did so before the maneuver could even be completed. Remember, the enemy thought Allied resolve would erode. They thought public pressure and political debate in Allied capitals would translate into slower decision-making on the battlefield. They thought that a well-executed feint would go undetected long enough to complete the repositioning needed for the second phase. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Allied resolve has not only held, it has sharpened. Allied decision-making, far from slowing down, accelerated to a pace the enemy's own planners apparently did not anticipate. And the feint, rather than drawing Allied forces into a trap, drew enemy logistics infrastructure into the targeting crosshairs of a strike package that had been quietly assembled for weeks. History has seen this kind of miscalculation before. When an adversary assumes that the opponent's political noise means operational paralysis, they misread the signal. Debate in a democracy is not weakness. Sometimes it is the sound of a force making a very difficult decision very carefully, and tonight that decision has been made. What makes this moment so consequential and so dangerous is that the enemy's latest move happened at a time when its central leadership is under compounding pressure from multiple directions. Hardline internal factions want a decisive, visible offensive success to justify the enormous costs already incurred. Military commanders want more resources, more time, and more strategic latitude before committing to the next phase. Economic advisors are warning that the material costs of a prolonged operational posture are approaching a threshold that cannot be sustained indefinitely. And populations in regions adjacent to the conflict zone want reassurance that there is an endpoint, a defined objective, rather than an open-ended commitment with no visible horizon. The central leadership is balancing all of these demands simultaneously while continuing to prosecute a conflict that has not delivered the rapid, decisive outcomes initially projected. And when leaders in that position make sudden, dramatic battlefield moves, like a large-scale voluntary withdrawal, they are not doing it from a position of strength. They are doing it from a position of pressure. They are doing it because the political cost of standing still, of appearing to have no answer, of being seen as static in the face of Allied momentum, that cost has become too high to absorb. They needed a move, they made one, and Allied command was ready for it. Allied Command's formal intelligence assessment, now distributed to all partner defense ministries, was designed to signal clearly that the alliance is not willing to allow a tactical withdrawal to be misread as an opportunity for uncoordinated advance. Senior officials said plainly that the enemy's repositioning was inconsistent with a force intending to disengage, and that all Allied movements should be calibrated accordingly. That is careful, deliberate language for, this is a trap, and anyone who moves without authorization into the vacated ground will be walking into it. You do not usually hear that level of operational candor from a multinational command structure unless the risk of misinterpretation by your own side is considered real and immediate. The fact that this warning was issued and issued publicly tells you something important about the speed with which some Allied elements were already preparing to move forward into the vacated positions. The order was not to celebrate. The order was to hold, assess, and wait for the strike to finish what it started. Meanwhile, the Allied political leadership addressed their respective nations in a series of coordinated, carefully worded statements released throughout the evening. One senior leader said, "We have seen this maneuver before, and we will not be drawn into it." Another said, "Our forces responded not with emotion, but with intelligence, and that is precisely why we remain in a position of operational strength." And a third said something that no official had said quite so plainly in recent months. The enemy is not retreating because they are defeated. They are repositioning because they are planning, and we are already ahead of that plan. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from leadership that understands just how high the stakes of the next 72 hours have become, and that is choosing to communicate that understanding clearly to their own publics before the next phase begins. Here is what makes the situation even more complex tonight. The enemy's withdrawal was not an isolated event. Alongside the main front repositioning, a secondary force in the northern sector increased patrol and probing activity along a line that had been quiet for over 2 months, suggesting a potential diversionary pressure designed to stretch Allied monitoring attention. Naval assets in an adjacent maritime zone conducted an unusual pattern of low-level maneuvers that analysts described as a signals-gathering operation, likely assessing Allied electronic readiness. Irregular forces affiliated with the main enemy structure increased activity targeting Allied communication infrastructure in rear areas, small scale but coordinated and timed precisely with the main withdrawal. All of this happened within the same 12-hour window. When a force of this sophistication moves multiple pieces simultaneously, it means something larger is underway, and the visible move is almost never the most important one. Today, the most visible move was the withdrawal, but the simultaneous pressure across secondary fronts tells you that the withdrawal was the decoy, and Allied forces responded to all of it. Senior analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes in the next phase. One is that the enemy is preparing a concentrated offensive push on a narrower front, using the breadth of today's multi-point activity to identify the weakest point in Allied responsiveness before committing to a decisive thrust. Another is that the enemy is attempting to exhaust Allied strike resources by forcing rapid, large-scale responses to coordinated but ultimately limited provocations, essentially draining the magazine before the real operation begins. A third possibility, and the one that is generating the most concern in Allied intelligence circles, is that the enemy is attempting to create a gap between Allied political decision-making and Allied military response speed, hoping that the next provocation will be debated in capitals long enough for the operational window to open and close before authorization arrives. But today, Allied forces took that third option off the table. They didn't wait for full political consensus to work through every layer of the command structure. They didn't hesitate while the threat window was open. They didn't allow the perfect to become the enemy of the timely. They responded within the window. And that response, fast, precise, and strategically calibrated, is the single most important thing that happened today. What we are watching now is a test of operational intelligence, not firepower, not manpower, but the capacity to read a battlefield correctly under conditions designed to deceive. The enemy wants to know whether Allied command will mistake motion for meaning, whether a retreat looks enough like a victory that Allied forces will advance into it. Allied command wants to demonstrate that it will not, that it can distinguish between what a battlefield shows and what a battlefield is. Allied partner nations want to prevent the kind of catastrophic Allied advance into prepared ground that has historically turned apparent victories into generational disasters. And the enemy's own strategic community wants to prevent the kind of preemptive Allied strike that just occurred from becoming the new normal. Because if Allied forces can consistently get ahead of enemy repositioning, the elastic defense doctrine becomes not just ineffective but dangerous to attempt. That is the test. And as of tonight, Allied command has passed the first round of it. Tonight, intelligence officials who are now monitoring enemy communication patterns following the strikes say the picture is becoming clearer by the hour. They say the enemy's second echelon command structure has gone into what appears to be an emergency coordination cycle, a pattern of high-frequency, short-duration communications that typically follows an unexpected disruption to a planned operation. They say the logistics damage from today's strikes is more significant than initially assessed, that at least 3 of the targeted nodes were not redundant, meaning there is no immediate fallback capacity to replace what was destroyed. And they say the enemy's decision to initiate the withdrawal without a fully established alternative logistics chain in place suggests either overconfidence, timeline pressure, or both, and that either explanation points to a command structure operating under duress rather than from a position of calm strategic control. The enemy is not broken tonight. Let no one misread this moment in that direction, but the enemy is disrupted. And disruption, when it happens at the right moment and when it happens in the gap between the first move and the second, can change the entire trajectory of what follows. Their response today, surgical, swift, and strategically far-sighted, sent a message to the enemy command that Allied intelligence is not operating on a lag. And it sent a message to every Allied partner nation watching that the alliance's operational cohesion is not only intact, but sharper than it has been at any point in this conflict. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about exactly what the enemy hoped to achieve with today's withdrawal, and how far along the second phase plan was before Allied strikes disrupted it. But what we do know is that Allied command's response tonight was not only timely, it was transformative. It denied the enemy the operational window they needed. It demonstrated a level of intelligence integration that will force the enemy to reconsider every assumption underlying their next move. And it established clearly and unmistakably that Allied forces are not watching this conflict unfold. They are inside it, ahead of it, shaping it. What happens next will depend entirely on what the enemy chooses to do in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they absorb today's disruption and recalibrate, if they pull back further, reassess their strategic timeline, and return to a posture that does not immediately threaten a second phase offensive, then this moment will be remembered as the inflection point where Allied preemptive capability changed the terms of the conflict. If they attempt to accelerate, to push through the disruption with whatever logistics capacity remains, Allied command has already shown it is ready to respond again, faster if necessary, with greater reach if required. And tonight, for the first time in months, the enemy appears to be uncertain. The front line is quiet, too quiet, not the quiet of exhaustion, not the quiet of defeat. The quiet of a command structure running new calculations, the quiet of planners going back to maps and timelines and asking questions that before today they thought they had already answered. Because tonight the enemy learned something they have had to relearn at every critical juncture of this conflict. That operational deception requires a target that can be deceived. That elastic defense requires an adversary willing to advance without thinking. And that the moment you mistake your opponent's discipline for slowness, their restraint for weakness, and their silence for inattention, is the moment they strike the thing you most needed to protect. This story is far from over. The next move is coming. The next phase is already being planned behind closed doors in locations we cannot name tonight. But tonight, one thing is clear. Allied command is not reacting to this conflict. They are directing it. The enemy's most sophisticated maneuver of this entire campaign was read, preempted, and neutralized before it could be completed. And the lesson that sends to every actor watching this conflict, every government, every military planner, every intelligence service studying the patterns of this war, is one that will shape every calculation that follows. The trap was set, the trap was seen, and the trap was dismantled. We will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.